As we enter 2026, something has quietly broken in global markets, and almost no one is describing it correctly. Right now, at this exact moment, the same ounce of silver carries different meanings depending on where you stand. In New York, it trades like a financial asset. In Shanghai, it trades like a production lifeline. Gold rises even as the dollar holds firm. Commodities surge, stall, then surge again, not because demand is exploding, but because coordination is failing. To most observers, this looks like confusion. It isn't. Markets are not panicking. They are adjusting to a reality they can no longer smooth over. For decades, price acted like a shared language. One number told one story everywhere. It coordinated behavior across borders without asking anyone to understand the machinery underneath. As long as the structure held, price absorbed friction. It forgave delays. It hid shortages. It turned stress into noise. That structure is still standing, but it is no longer carrying the load. When price begins to fracture across regions, across markets, across paper and physical forms, it is not a glitch. It is a signal that price is no longer functioning as a shared truth, but as a local negotiation under pressure. This does not happen during collapse, it happens before it. History shows that when price loses its universal meaning, the system has entered a new phase, one where efficiency gives way to survivability, and volatility becomes structural rather than emotional. This video is not about forecasting markets. It is about understanding what changes when price stops coordinating reality and starts exposing where pressure can no longer be hidden. Because once price stops telling the truth, something else begins to decide outcomes. For decades, price worked not because it was accurate, but because it was enforced by an invisible structure that made dishonesty expensive. When silver was cheaper in one place and more expensive in another, capital moved without emotion. Goods followed without hesitation. Ships sailed. Vaults opened, and profit closed the gap. This process wasn't a theory or a belief. It was automatic. It was gravity, and gravity doesn't ask for permission. That mechanism did more than create efficiency. It created trust. You didn't need to know where silver was mined, who refined it, or which vault held it. You didn't need to watch inventories or shipping lanes. You trusted the price because you trusted the system behind it. Price became a universal language. One number carried the same meaning everywhere. And that simplicity allowed the entire global system to coordinate without friction. But that universality was never natural. It was conditional. It depended on several forces aligning at the same time. Trade routes had to be reliable. Logistics had to be boring. Inventories had to be deep enough that shortages never reached the surface. Financial institutions had to absorb shocks quietly without passing stress downstream. And above all, the system needed margin. Margin is the most misunderstood force in history. It is the invisible buffer that forgives mistakes before anyone notices them. It hides delays. It smooths inefficiencies. It allows price to lie just enough to keep the system calm. As long as margin exists, reality can be bent without consequence. And price can continue to feel truthful even when it isn't. This is why global pricing worked so well in the decades after 1945. The world wasn't just growing, it was growing with slack. Industrial capacity exceeded immediate demand. Energy was cheap. Debt expanded, but productivity expanded faster. When something broke, the system absorbed it, redistributed the pressure, and moved on. Price didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be trusted, and trust held, not because people were smarter or more disciplined, but because the structure carried the weight for them. But trust is not a permanent state. It is structural, and when structure weakens, trust doesn't shatter loudly. It thins quietly. At first, nothing looks wrong. Small delays appear. Minor shortages stop resolving themselves automatically. Logistics become slightly less predictable. Institutions spend more time managing perception than moving material. Most people don't notice these shifts. They just feel that markets are getting strange, jumpy, hard to read. That feeling is not psychological. It is mechanical. It is what happens when price is slowly forced to stop smoothing reality and start reflecting it. That is the moment price begins to behave differently, not as gravity, but as a warning signal. And once that shift begins, the next phase of the system is already in motion, whether anyone is prepared for it or not. Capacity never disappears in one dramatic moment. It erodes quietly, then all at once. At first, nothing looks broken. Ships still move. Warehouses still report inventory. Contracts still settle. But beneath the surface, time stretches. Deliveries take longer than promised. Buffers thin. Small delays stop being absorbed automatically and start stacking on top of each other. What once felt smooth begins to feel tight, even though the system is still technically functioning. Then coordination weakens. Decisions that used to take days take weeks. Exceptions multiply. Temporary fixes become permanent habits. Workarounds replace solutions. Trust is no longer assumed. It becomes conditional. At that point, the system hasn't failed, but it has lost flexibility, and flexibility is what allowed price to behave like truth in the first place. This is the moment when arbitrage quietly breaks. On paper, the mechanism still exists, prices differ, spreads appear, opportunities are visible. But in reality, the bridge that closes those gaps is no longer reliable. You can trade a futures contract in milliseconds, but you cannot teleport physical material. You cannot summon inventory that isn't there. You cannot move metal faster than logistics allow. When moving the asset becomes harder than trading the promise. Price splits. Paper price continues to reflect financial convenience, liquidity, and leverage. Physical price begins to reflect urgency, access, and survival. These two prices no longer answer to the same forces. And pretending they do is how most people lose the plot. This is where the mainstream explanation fails. Higher prices are dismissed as speculation. Volatility is blamed on emotion. Analysts argue about sentiment, positioning, and narratives. But none of that explains what is actually happening on the ground, because factories do not speculate. They do not chase charts. They secure continuity. When an industrial buyer pays more than expected, it is not because they believe the price will rise tomorrow. It is because the cost of not having the material is existential. Without input, production stops. When production stops, workers go home. When contracts fail, companies die. That calculation has nothing to do with optimism or fear. It has everything to do with survival. That logic does not care about indicators, headlines, or opinions. It cares about one thing only: certainty of supply. And when enough participants begin thinking this way, price can no longer coordinate the market smoothly. It is forced into a new role. It stops being a guide for behavior and starts acting like a stress map, highlighting exactly where pressure is becoming unbearable. Most people don't recognize this shift when it happens. They just feel that markets are acting irrational, disconnected, almost hostile. But markets aren't breaking. They are telling the truth too clearly for a system that no longer has the margin to hide it. And once price starts revealing pressure instead of smoothing it, the next signal is already forming, whether anyone is prepared to see it or not. Silver is not special, and that is exactly why it matters. It is early. Silver sits at the fault line between two worlds that are starting to separate. It is traded as money, priced by financial markets. and consumed as a physical input by industry. That dual identity makes it unusually sensitive to structural stress, because it cannot hide behind abstraction for long. When the system tightens, silver feels it first. When silver begins trading at different prices in different places, it is not telling you a story about silver. It is exposing stress inside the machinery that once forced all prices to agree. For decades, that machinery ensured one global truth, one benchmark, one reference point. When silver breaks away from that framework, it means the framework itself is no longer strong enough to enforce consistency. This is why focusing only on silver misses the point. The same fracture is already visible elsewhere. Energy prices no longer move as a single global market. They fragment by region, by access, by security. Food prices diverge not because the world cannot produce enough calories, but because distribution and stability matter more than output. Critical materials are no longer priced by benchmarks alone, but by availability, timing, and strategic necessity. In all of these cases, the pattern is the same. Physical reality is beginning to override financial abstraction. The paper layer still exists, but it no longer has the authority it once did. Price is no longer coordinating behavior smoothly. It is signaling constraint, tension, and prioritization. This is where people instinctively look for villains. They blame banks for manipulation, speculators for distortion, governments for incompetence. Those stories are comforting because they suggest the problem is intentional and therefore reversible. But the cause is deeper and far less negotiable. The system is not failing because of bad actors. It is changing because its objective function has shifted. For decades, the global system optimized for efficiency, lowest cost, fastest delivery, maximum leverage. That logic worked when margin was abundant and shocks were rare. But efficiency is fragile. It leaves no room for error. What the system is doing now is something colder and more rational. It is optimizing for survivability. Redundancy replaces speed. Access replaces price. Security replaces efficiency. That transition is not smooth, and it is never polite. It produces fragmentation, volatility, and behavior that looks irrational if you are still using the old mental model. Silver is simply the first place where this new logic became visible. Not because it is unique, but because it cannot lie for long. It must exist physically. It must move. It must be delivered. And when the system can no longer guarantee that movement at scale, the truth surfaces in the price. Most people will not recognize this shift while it is happening. They will argue about charts and narratives, convinced the system will snap back to normal. But systems do not revert once their objective changes. They adapt, narrow, and select. And when silver stops behaving like a financial asset and starts behaving like a strategic resource, it is telling you something uncomfortable about what comes next. Because once physical reality takes precedence over abstraction, the rules that governed the last era quietly expire, and a very different set of pressures begins to shape outcomes. In a stable system, price is universal because the system can afford to pretend that everything is equal everywhere. One number tells one story. One benchmark coordinates millions of decisions without friction. Distance, timing, and risk are smoothed away by margin. As long as that margin exists, price feels objective, neutral, almost natural. But universality is not a law of nature. It is a luxury of capacity. In a stressed system, that luxury disappears. Price fragments because reality fragments first. What used to be hidden by buffers becomes visible through gaps. A paper price emerges that reflects liquidity, leverage, and convenience. It answers to balance sheets and models. A physical price emerges that reflects availability, timing, and logistics. It answers to trucks, ships, warehouses, and delivery schedules. And then there is a third layer most people never see until it is too late, the strategic price, which reflects necessity. It answers to one question only: what happens if this doesn't arrive on time? Most people live inside the first price. They watch screens, they argue about charts, they debate narratives. Strategic buyers live inside the third. They don't ask whether something is cheap or expensive. They ask whether it will be there when they need it. That difference in mindset is why prices begin to diverge in ways that feel irrational to observers who are still using the old map. When these prices separate, price loses its role as information. It no longer tells you what something is worth in a general sense. It tells you who is desperate, who has access, and who is being quietly prioritized. It becomes a negotiation between risk and urgency, between trust and fear, between convenience and survival. That negotiation is not clean. It produces volatility, resentment, and confusion. But it is not manipulation. It is adaptation. This is the part that unsettles people the most. They want someone to blame because blame implies control. But fragmentation is what systems do when they can no longer carry everyone equally. The system has crossed a threshold where pretending that all units are interchangeable becomes dangerous. From that point forward, equality of price gives way to hierarchy of access. Once this shift begins, it rarely reverses quickly. Universal price does not die in a single crash. It erodes as exceptions become normal. Special arrangements proliferate. Off-market deals replace benchmarks. Priority access replaces open competition. The official price continues to exist, but it loses authority. It becomes a reference, not a truth. This is why the death of universal price feels so destabilizing. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through inconsistency, through gaps that don't close, through spreads that widen instead of collapsing, through moments where the number on the screen no longer matches the decision being made on the ground. And once that realization sets in, markets stop being a place where everyone plays the same game. They become a place where different players are operating under different rules at the same time. That is not the end of the system. It is the end of the illusion that the system was ever neutral. Because when universal price dies, the question is no longer what something costs. The question becomes who gets it, who doesn't, and why. And that question leads directly into what comes next. When price stops telling the truth, volatility stops being a phase and becomes a condition. It is no longer driven by fear, greed, or headlines. It is driven by constraint. The system has lost its buffers. And without buffers, every movement carries weight. Small changes in demand create outsized reactions because there is nothing left to absorb them. Small disruptions cascade because slack has already been consumed. What looks like chaos on the surface is actually sensitivity underneath. This is why markets now jump instead of glide. Prices gap instead of adjust. Correlations break, then snap back, then break again. It is not because participants are irrational. It is because the system is tight. In a tight system, there is no room to negotiate smoothly. Everything becomes binary. Either supply arrives or it doesn't. Either access is granted or it isn't. And price reflects that tension instantly. For years, policymakers and institutions have tried to normalize markets. They talk about stability, soft landings, orderly transitions. But normalization assumes margin. It assumes spare capacity. It assumes that shocks can be spread out over time. That assumption no longer holds. The system is no longer designed to be smooth. It is designed to survive impacts without collapsing outright. And survivability looks volatile from the outside. This is the uncomfortable truth. Volatility is not a malfunction. It is the visible behavior of a system operating without slack. When margin disappears, time compresses, reactions accelerate, corrections overshoot. Price becomes jumpy because the underlying structure has become brittle. Not weak, but brittle. Strong under normal load, unstable under stress. This is also why traditional explanations feel empty. Analysts blame traders, algorithms, speculation. They point to sentiment indicators and positioning data. But those are surface effects. The deeper driver is that the system can no longer smooth reality. It can only react to it. And reactions, by definition, are abrupt. Once volatility becomes structural, it feeds on itself. Risk managers tighten limits. Inventories are reduced further. Participants shorten time horizons. Everyone becomes more defensive at the same time. That collective behavior removes even more margin from the system, making the next move sharper than the last. Volatility stops being episodic and starts clustering, not because of panic, but because of design. Most people still treat volatility as something that will eventually pass. They wait for markets to calm down, to behave normally again. But normality was a function of excess capacity, not a natural state. When margin is gone, calm becomes temporary and instability becomes the baseline. That is why every attempt to suppress volatility ends up creating more of it later. And here is the part that unsettles even seasoned observers. Margin, once lost, is extremely difficult to rebuild. It requires time, surplus, and restraint. It requires producing more than you consume, investing ahead of need, and accepting inefficiency. Those are the opposite of how late cycle systems behave. Late cycle systems optimize for control, not slack, which means volatility is not a storm to be waited out. It is the weather, and once you understand that, the next question is no longer how to avoid volatility, but how systems decide who is protected from it and who is exposed to it. Because that decision is already being made, quietly, everywhere at once. The most important takeaway is not about silver, gold, or any single asset, because focusing on one market misses what is actually changing underneath. What matters now is how to read signals in a world where price no longer coordinates reality the way it used to. When prices diverge across regions, markets, and forms, they are not lying at random. They are revealing where pressure can no longer be diluted, delayed, or exported. They are showing you where the system has run out of room. This is why the current moment feels different, even though nothing has formally collapsed. Governments still function. Institutions still operate. Trade still moves. But every decision feels heavier than before. Every intervention seems to solve one problem while creating two more somewhere else. That sensation is not emotional. It is structural. It is what happens when a system that once optimized everything is forced to choose what it can still carry. In that environment, price stops acting like a guide and starts acting like a spotlight. It illuminates stress points instead of smoothing them over. It tells you which supply chains are fragile, which regions are being prioritized, which industries are quietly protected, and which are being left to absorb volatility. This is why price signals now feel uneven and unfair. They are no longer trying to be neutral. They are expressing hierarchy. That shift changes how power operates. Governments respond differently when they can no longer stabilize everything at once. Industries plan differently when access matters more than benchmarks. Conflicts emerge not because leaders suddenly become reckless, but because pressure concentrates where coordination breaks down faster than deterrence can adjust. Power doesn't announce these changes, it reveals them indirectly, through pricing that no longer makes sense under the old rules. This is also why so many people feel disoriented. They are still using a mental model built for a world where price coordinated behavior globally. In that world, volatility was a signal of emotion. Spreads were temporary. Arbitrage always closed gaps. Today, those assumptions no longer hold. Stress is not being shared evenly, and price is how that unevenness becomes visible. The world is not ending, it is narrowing. The system is no longer trying to optimize efficiency everywhere. It is selecting what remains viable under constraint. Some connections will be maintained, others will fray. Some flows will be protected, others will be allowed to break. And price fragmented, volatile, and inconsistent is the first place where those choices surface. So the question going forward is not what will happen to prices next week or next month. The deeper question is what happens to a world when price stops coordinating behavior and stress begins to choose outcomes instead. Because once that process begins, it does not reverse quietly. It moves through trade, politics, and eventually conflict, reshaping the order long before most people realize what has changed. That is where we are now. And that is why the next phase of this series will not focus on markets alone, but on how pressure moves through systems once price loses its authority. Because when price stops telling the truth, power doesn't disappear, it relocates.